In this episode, we journey back in time to uncover the story of a technology so profound that its impact is felt in nearly every aspect of our modern lives. It's a story of ink, metal, and immense pressure. It is the history of the printing press. Imagine for a moment a world without printed books. A world where knowledge was a rare and precious commodity, accessible only to the wealthiest elite. Before the 15th century, this was reality. Every single book was copied by hand, a painstaking process undertaken by scribes, often in monasteries. A single volume could take a year or more to produce, requiring the skins of hundreds of animals for its parchment pages. Because of this, books were astronomically expensive, as valuable as a farm or a small estate. Knowledge was fragile, subject to the errors of a tired scribe, and its spread was limited to the speed of a horse or a ship. Into this world of information's scarcity, a new invention would arrive that would shatter the old order and remake civilization. The printing press was not merely a new tool, it was a revolution. It represented a turning point in human history, comparable to the invention of writing itself. It allowed for the rapid, inexpensive, and accurate duplication of texts on a mass scale, turning a rare treasure into an accessible commodity. This was the invention that would fuel the Renaissance, power the Protestant Reformation, and ignite the scientific revolution. It would standardize languages, dramatically increase literacy, and lay the very foundation for our modern information age. In this episode, we will trace the complete arc of this incredible story. Our journey will begin not in Europe, but in China and Korea, where the earliest forms of printing, from woodblocks to the first movable metal type, were pioneered centuries before Gutenberg. We will then travel to mid-15th century Mainz, Germany, to meet the man himself, Johannes Gutenberg. We will explore how his unique system, combining a durable metal alloy, a precision hand mold for casting type, an adapted screw press, and a new oil-based ink made mass production possible. Finally, we will follow the explosive spread of his invention across Europe and examine the profound and lasting legacy of a technology that taught humanity how to speak in one voice to millions. Part 1. The World Before Gutenberg. To truly understand the revolution that Johannes Gutenberg unleashed upon the world, we must first recognize that he did not conjure his invention from thin air. The seeds of his idea, the very concept of printing, had been planted centuries earlier and thousands of miles away. The story of the printing press does not begin in 15th century Germany, but in the sophisticated and inventive cultures of East Asia, particularly in Tang Dynasty China. Long before the idea of a mechanical press was even a glimmer in a European mind, Chinese innovators had already solved the first great challenge of mass communication: how to create multiple copies of a text without writing each one by hand. Their elegant and powerful solution was a technique known as woodblock printing. The process was a masterful display of craftsmanship. It began with a text, carefully written out by a skilled calligrapher on a sheet of thin paper. This paper was then taken and pasted face down onto a smooth, prepared block of wood, often from a pear or a jujube tree. The paper was so thin that the ink from the characters would soak through, leaving a clear, reversed image of the text on the surface of the wood. Now, the most painstaking part of the work began. A master carver, using a set of sharp knives and gouges, would meticulously chisel away the wood from the blank areas of the page, leaving only the strokes of the characters standing out in high relief. Every line, every dot, every delicate curve of the original calligraphy had to be perfectly preserved. The result was a single wooden block that was a mirror image of an entire page. Once the block was carved, the printing could commence. A worker would apply ink, not with a roller, but with a brush, carefully coating the raised characters. A sheet of paper was then laid over the block, and the back of the paper was gently but firmly rubbed with a flat pad or a dry brush. This transferred the ink from the block to the paper, creating a perfect impression of the page. The paper was peeled off, set aside to dry, and the block was ready to be inked again for the next copy. This method, while labor-intensive to create the initial block, was remarkably efficient for production. Once a block was carved, a single printer could produce over 1,000 copies in a single day. For the first time, texts could be replicated on a grand scale. This technology was initially used for printing patterns on textiles and for short religious charms, but its potential for reproducing texts was quickly realized. By the 9th century, woodblock printing was being used to produce calendars, almanacs, and, most importantly, religious texts. The primary driver for this was Buddhism, a religion that placed great value on the sacredness of its scriptures and the karmic merit that could be gained by reproducing them. The most stunning surviving example of this early art form is the Diamond Sutra. Discovered in the early 20th century by a monk in a sealed-off cave in Dunhuang, China, it is a magnificent scroll, nearly 16 feet long. At its end, a colophon, a small inscription, explicitly states that it was made on the 11th of May in the year 868 for universal free distribution by a man named Wang Jie in order to honor his parents. This makes the Diamond Sutra the world's oldest known complete and dated printed book. Its existence is a testament to the sophistication and maturity of woodblock printing technology in China, a full 6 centuries before Gutenberg began his work. Woodblock printing was a powerful and enduring technology. It spread from China to neighboring countries like Korea and Japan and remained the dominant form of printing in East Asia for centuries. It was perfectly suited for cultures with complex, character-based writing systems. However, it had one significant drawback: a lack of flexibility. Each block was carved for a specific page of a specific book. If a single character was wrong, the entire block had to be painstakingly corrected or carved anew. If you wanted to print a different book, you had to start the entire process of carving a new set of hundreds of blocks from scratch. The logical next step, the next great conceptual leap, was to move from printing an entire page to printing with individual, reusable components. The idea of movable type was born. This revolutionary concept came from a man of humble origins, an artisan named Bi Sheng, who lived during the Song dynasty in the 11th century. Our knowledge of him and his invention comes from the Dream Pool Essays, a wide-ranging work written by the scholar official Shen Kuo. Shen Kuo described Bi Sheng's process with admiration and detail. Bi Sheng did not use wood or metal for his type. Instead, he took pieces of fine, sticky clay and carved individual Chinese characters onto their surfaces, one character per small clay block. He then fired these blocks in a kiln, much like pottery, to make them hard and durable. This gave him a collection of individual characters that could be arranged and rearranged as needed. His method of setting the type was just as ingenious. He prepared a shallow iron tray which he covered with a mixture of pine resin, wax, and paper ash. He would then select the clay characters he needed for a text and press them into this mixture, side by side, forming the lines of the page. He would then gently heat the iron tray from below, causing the resin and wax mixture to melt slightly. At this point, he would take a flat board and press it firmly and evenly across the surface of the type, ensuring that all the characters were set at precisely the same height, creating a perfectly level printing surface. The tray was then allowed to cool, and the mixture would harden, locking the clay characters rigidly in place. From there, the process was similar to woodblock printing. The type was inked, and paper was pressed against it. The genius of Bi Sheng's system was its reusability. Once the desired number of copies had been printed, the iron tray was simply heated again. The resin and wax mixture would soften, and the individual clay characters could be plucked out, cleaned, and sorted away, ready to be used for a completely new text. Shen Kuo noted that for efficiency, Bi Sheng would often keep 2 trays going at once. While one was being used for printing, he would be setting the type for the next page on the other. And to speed up the hunt for specific characters, he created large revolving wooden cases with the characters organized by rhyme, much like a modern filing system. This was a complete, well-thought-out system for printing, a conceptual breakthrough of the highest order. It was the first time in history that anyone had devised a method based on discrete, recombinable units of text. The idea of movable type continued to develop and was taken to a new level of sophistication on the Korean peninsula during the Goryeo dynasty. Korean scholars and officials were keenly aware of the Chinese printing traditions, but they faced unique challenges. The wooden blocks used for printing were vulnerable. They could wear out, be destroyed by insects, or, most devastatingly, be lost in fires during frequent invasions, such as those by the Mongols in the 13th century. The preservation of knowledge, particularly the vast canon of Buddhist scriptures, was a matter of national importance. The solution was to create a printing technology that was as permanent and durable as possible. The Koreans turned to metal. The development of metal movable type in Korea was a complex and expensive undertaking, often sponsored by the royal court. The process was far more demanding than creating clay type. It typically began with a calligrapher carving a character onto a piece of fine-grained wood, such as beechwood. This wooden character was then used to create an impression in a trough filled with fine, wet sand, forming a mold. Molten bronze was then carefully poured into these sand molds to cast the individual metal characters. Once cooled and solidified, the metal type was cleaned and filed to ensure uniformity. This was precision metalwork, requiring immense skill and resources. But the result was a set of type that was incredibly durable, capable of producing crisp, clean impressions on paper, and could be reused almost indefinitely. The Korean printers produced a number of books using this technology, but the most significant surviving artifact is a book known as the Jikji. Its full title translates to Anthology of Great Buddhist Priests, Zen Teachings. A copy of the Jikji, printed in the year 1377, currently resides in the National Library of France. This modest book, printed at the Hongdauk Temple, holds a remarkable distinction. It is the oldest existing book in the world printed with movable metal type. It is a quiet but powerful testament to the advanced state of Korean printing technology, predating Johannes Gutenberg's famous Bible by more than 75 years. The existence of the Jikji proves that the core technological components of Gutenberg's system, movable type, cast from metal, were in use in Asia decades before he began his work in Mainz. This raises a crucial and fascinating question. If these brilliant innovations, woodblock printing, clay movable type, and even metal movable type, were developed and refined in China and Korea so far in advance of Europe, why didn't they trigger the same kind of explosive social, religious, and scientific revolution that the printing press would later unleash in the West? Why did this seemingly world-changing technology not, in fact, change the world in the same way? The answer is not simple and involves a number of cultural and political factors, but the primary reason lies in a fundamental difference: the nature of the written language itself. The printing revolution in Europe was built upon the elegance and efficiency of the Latin alphabet. The entire system of Western writing, with all its variations, is based on a very small set of abstract symbols, roughly 24 letters plus numbers and punctuation. A typesetter in Gutenberg's workshop only needed to have a large supply of a few dozen characters to be able to compose any text imaginable. The letters are combined and recombined in an almost infinite number of ways to form words. This makes movable type an exceptionally well-suited technology for alphabetic scripts. The situation in China was vastly different. The Chinese writing system is logographic, meaning that each character generally represents a whole word or concept. To be literate requires knowing several thousand characters. A complete set of Chinese type for a printing shop would need to consist of tens of thousands of individual, unique characters. The logistical challenge this presented was immense. Imagine the size of the workshop needed to simply store all of those characters. Now imagine the work of the typesetter. Instead of quickly picking letters from a small, easily memorized case, the Chinese typesetter had to search through a massive library of thousands of characters to find the single one they needed for each word in the text. The process of setting a page of type was incredibly slow and laborious. Because of this inherent complexity, movable type never fully displaced woodblock printing in China, Korea, or Japan. For many printing jobs, especially for popular texts that were reprinted often, it was simply more economical and efficient to carve a set of woodblocks once and store them, rather than go through the tedious process of setting and resetting thousands of individual pieces of type. Movable type was used, particularly for large, state-sponsored projects like printing historical records or encyclopedias, but it did not become a widespread commercial enterprise for the mass production of all kinds of information. Other factors also played a role. In both China and Korea, printing was often a top-down affair, sponsored and controlled by the imperial court or the aristocracy. The goal was often the preservation of classical literature or religious orthodoxy, not the dissemination of new or challenging ideas to a mass audience. There wasn't the same kind of burgeoning commercial market for books that was beginning to emerge in Europe. Furthermore, the high cultural value placed on the art of calligraphy in East Asia meant that hand-copied texts often retained a prestige that a printed work, with its mechanical uniformity, could not match. The work of the machine could not rival the soul expressed through the hand of a master. The technology, therefore, while brilliant, remained largely in the service of established power structures. It was a tool for preservation more than a catalyst for disruption. The ground was not yet fertile for the kind of information revolution that was to come. For that, the idea of movable type would have to make its way, perhaps independently, to a different continent and into the hands of a German goldsmith with a vision for changing the world. Part 2. Johannes Gutenberg's Revolution. Our story now crosses continents, moving from the ancient innovations of the East to the heart of a Europe on the cusp of profound change. The mid-15th century was a time of burgeoning intellectual curiosity, a period we now recognize as the dawn of the Renaissance. Universities were growing, trade was creating a new class of wealthy merchants with an appetite for knowledge, and a deep-seated spiritual yearning was creating demand for religious texts. Yet the supply of books, painstakingly copied by hand, remained a mere trickle, unable to quench this growing thirst. The world was primed for a breakthrough, and it would arrive in the bustling German city of Mainz through the efforts of a man whose name would become synonymous with the birth of a new age, Johannes Gutenberg. To understand Gutenberg, we must first dispel the myth of the lone, impoverished genius struck by a single flash of inspiration. The historical reality is far more interesting. Johannes Gensfleisch zur Latin. Zum Gutenberg, to give him his full name, was not a scholar or a scribe. He was a man of the world, born around the year 1400 into a patrician family in Mainz. Crucially, his family's business was in metalwork. Gutenberg was trained as a goldsmith and a metallurgist. He understood the properties of metals, how to melt them, how to cast them, and how to work them with precision. This background, this intimate, hands-on knowledge of working with metal, would prove to be the single most important factor in his eventual success. He was not a man of letters, but a man of craft, an artisan who approached the problem of the book not from a literary perspective, but from an engineering one. Like many ambitious men of his time, Gutenberg's life was not without turmoil. Political strife in Mainz forced him into exile for a number of years in the city of Strasbourg. It is here, in the 1430s and 1440s, that the historical record first shows him engaged in secretive experiments. He formed business partnerships, borrowing money to fund a mysterious venture that involved a press and something he called Aventur und Kunst, adventure and art. His work was shrouded in secrecy, for he knew that if his idea was successful, it would be immensely profitable and quickly copied. Legal documents from this period reveal a fallout with his partners after the death of one of them, with the surviving partners suing Gutenberg to be included in the venture or have their investment returned. While the exact nature of his work was kept hidden, the court records speak of forms, lead, and tools for pressing. He was, without a doubt, already working on the fundamental components of the printing system. After returning to Mainz in the late 1440s, Gutenberg was determined to bring his project to fruition. He was a visionary who saw a vast, untapped market. He knew that if he could devise a method for producing books quickly, cheaply, and in large quantities, his fortune would be made. But his ambition outstripped his personal finances. To build the equipment he needed and to undertake a project large enough to showcase his technology, he needed a significant infusion of capital. This led him to a wealthy and shrewd moneylender named Johann Fust. Fust loaned Gutenberg the substantial sum of 800 guilders, an amount that could have bought a large farm, to fund the creation of his workshop. A few years later, Fust invested another 800 guilders. With this backing, Gutenberg was finally able to perfect the invention that had consumed him for 2 decades. The key to his success, and what set his work apart from all that had come before, was that he didn't just invent a single device. He perfected an entire integrated manufacturing system, a combination of 4 distinct, game-changing innovations. The first and most fundamental of these innovations was the type itself. Gutenberg knew that the wood used for block printing and the clay type pioneered by Bai Sheng were not up to the task. Wood wore down and could splinter, losing its sharp detail. Clay was brittle and could easily chip or shatter under the immense pressure required for a clean print. He needed a metal that was durable yet easy to cast. Drawing on his deep knowledge of metallurgy, he began to experiment with different alloys. Pure lead was too soft. The type would deform under pressure. After countless trials, he arrived at a precise and brilliant recipe, an alloy of lead, tin, and antimony. Lead formed the base, as it was cheap and had a low melting point. Tin was added because it helped the molten alloy flow more smoothly and prevented the lead from oxidizing too quickly. But the secret ingredient, the stroke of genius, was the antimony. Antimony possessed a unique and crucial chemical property. Unlike most metals, it expands slightly as it cools and solidifies. This meant that when the molten alloy was poured into a mold, the antimony would cause it to expand and press tightly against the sides, capturing every fine detail of the character with perfect, sharp fidelity. It also made the type itself much harder and more durable than lead alone. This special alloy, which would become the standard for printing for over 400 years, was the bedrock of his entire system. Having the right metal was only half the battle. How could he mass-produce tens of thousands of individual letters that were perfectly identical? Each letter, E, had to be exactly the same height as every other letter, E, and also the same height as every letter A and B and C, so they would form a flat, uniform surface for printing. His solution to this problem was arguably his single greatest invention, the hand mold. It was a remarkable piece of precision engineering. The hand mold was a two-part steel device that could be held in one hand. At the bottom of this mold, the operator would insert a small, engraved piece of hard metal called a matrix. The matrix was a negative impression of a letter created by punching a steel tool with the character carved on its tip into a block of softer copper. The worker would then close the two halves of the hand mold, creating a small rectangular cavity with the matrix at the base. With his other hand, he would use a small ladle to pour the molten type metal alloy into the mold. The metal cooled almost instantly. The worker would then open the mold, and a brand new, perfectly formed piece of type would fall out, bearing the raised image of the letter on its end. This process was so efficient that a single skilled worker could cast hundreds, perhaps thousands, of individual letters in a single day, each one a precise replica of the other. For the first time, the mass production of uniform, movable type was possible. Now, Gutenberg had his type, but he needed a way to transfer its image to paper. The gentle rubbing used in Chinese woodblock printing would not work well with the hard, unyielding surface of metal type. To get a crisp, black impression, he needed to apply a great deal of force, and it had to be applied evenly across the entire page. For this, he once again turned to existing technology and adapted it with brilliance. He took the screw press, a machine that had been used for centuries in Europe for making wine and olive oil, and also for pressing paper. The design was simple but powerful. A long handle turned a large wooden screw, which lowered a flat wooden plate known as a platen. Gutenberg built a heavy, sturdy press where he could place the locked-in frame of type on a flat bed. A sheet of paper was laid over the inked type, and then, with a strong pull of a lever, the platen was lowered, pressing the paper against the type with tremendous, uniform force. This ensured a complete and even transfer of ink, creating a sharp and legible print, page after page. The final piece of the puzzle was the ink itself. The standard ink used by scribes was a thin, water-based fluid made from oak galls and iron sulfate. Gutenberg quickly discovered that this ink was useless for his purposes. It was too watery and would simply bead up and run off the non-absorbent surface of his metal type. He needed an ink that was thick, sticky, and viscous, something that would cling to the face of the metal letters but transfer cleanly to the paper under pressure. He needed a substance that was more like a varnish or an oil paint. Again, he experimented and developed a new formula with a base of boiled linseed oil mixed with soot from pine resin to give it its deep black color. This new oil-based ink was a crucial, if often overlooked, part of his system. It had the perfect consistency to be applied to the type with a leather-covered ball to stick to the metal and to produce a dark, permanent impression on the page. With this complete system, the durable type metal, the rapid casting hand mold, the powerful screw press, and the sticky oil-based ink, Gutenberg was ready to embark on his great project. He wanted to prove that his mechanical method could not only be fast and efficient, but that it could also produce a work of the highest quality, a book that could rival and even exceed the beauty of the finest hand-copied manuscripts. He chose the most ambitious and revered text he could, the Latin Vulgate Bible. The project that would become known as the Gutenberg Bible, or the 42-line Bible, was a monumental undertaking. It was planned to be a 2-volume work with over 1,286 pages in total. It is estimated that Gutenberg's workshop would have needed to cast somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 individual pieces of type to have enough letters to set multiple pages at once. He purchased high-quality handmade paper from Italy, and for a smaller deluxe edition, he acquired a large quantity of vellum. He designed a beautiful typeface, a Gothic script known as textura, which mimicked the formal handwriting used by scribes for liturgical works. He laid out the text in 2 dense columns, with 42 lines per column, creating a page that was both legible and aesthetically pleasing. He even left blank spaces in the printed text for capital letters and decorative illustrations to be added later, by hand by specialist artists known as rubricators and illuminators. He was not trying to create a cheap-looking product. He was aiming to create a masterpiece that would be indistinguishable from the best manuscripts, but one he could produce in the hundreds. For about 3 years, from roughly 1452 to 1455, the workshop was a hive of activity, with as many as 20 workers casting type, setting the pages, inking the forms, and pulling the heavy lever of the press. It was a slow and steady process, but compared to the work of a scribe, it was lightning fast. But just as the project was nearing completion, disaster struck for Gutenberg. His investor, Johann Fust, sued him for the return of his money plus interest, which had ballooned to over 2,000 guilders. Gutenberg, who had poured every penny back into the project, could not pay. The court ruled in Fust's favor, and Gutenberg was forced to turn over his workshop, his presses, and a large portion of the nearly finished Bibles. Fust immediately went into business with Gutenberg's own highly skilled foreman, Peter Schöffer. Together, they completed the printing of the Bibles and began selling them, reaping the financial rewards of Gutenberg's life's work. It was a cruel and ironic twist of fate. The man who had invented the means of mass communication was largely written out of the initial story. Fust and Schöffer's printing business thrived, and for a time they were the ones credited with the invention. But while Gutenberg lost his original workshop, he did not lose his knowledge. He managed to establish a new, smaller printing press and continued to work for a few more years. And more importantly, the secret was out. The workers from his original workshop, now unemployed, scattered across Germany and then across Europe, taking the revolutionary knowledge of his system with them. Johannes Gutenberg may not have achieved the wealth he dreamed of, but his invention, a perfect synthesis of ingenuity and craft, had been unleashed. It was an idea far too powerful to be contained, and it was about to change the world forever. Part 3. The spread and impact of an idea. Though Johannes Gutenberg lost his workshop, his invention could not be contained. The knowledge he had perfected was a secret too powerful to remain in the hands of a few. The skilled workers he had trained, men who understood the intricate dance of casting type, setting pages, and operating the press, were now a diaspora of technical expertise. Like seeds scattered from a pod, they left Mainz and carried the art of artificial writing with them, seeking their fortunes in other cities. The spread of the printing press across Europe in the late 15th century was not a gradual diffusion. It was a wildfire. The technology went viral, spreading with a speed that was, for its time, simply breathtaking. Within a decade of the Gutenberg Bible's completion, presses were operating in other major German cities like Strasbourg and Cologne. Then, the technology crossed the Alps into Italy, a journey that would prove immensely consequential. In the 1460s, German printers established a press at the monastery of Subiaco, near Rome. But it was in the bustling, wealthy, and republican city of Venice that printing truly found its commercial heart. Venice was a hub of global trade, with established networks for distributing goods across the Mediterranean and beyond. Printers like Nicholas Jensen and Aldus Manutius set up shop and turned the city into the undisputed capital of the European book trade. They printed not just religious texts, but the rediscovered classics of Greece and Rome, works of philosophy, and new secular literature. From Italy, the press moved north into France, with a press established at the Sorbonne in Paris in 1470. It crossed the English Channel with William Caxton, a merchant and diplomat who had learned the trade in Cologne and set up a press at Westminster in 1476. By the year 1500, less than 50 years after Gutenberg had printed his Bible, there were active printing presses in over 250 cities across Europe, from Lisbon and Valencia in the west to Stockholm and Krakow in the north and east. The sheer volume of production in these first few decades, a period known to historians as the Age of Incunabula, or the cradle years of printing, is staggering. Before the press, Europe's monasteries and scriptoria might have produced a few thousand manuscripts in a year. By the year 1500, it is estimated that these new printing presses had already produced somewhere between 8 million and 20 million books. This was not merely a quantitative increase, it was a phased transition in the nature of information itself. Ideas, for the first time in human history, had achieved true mass. This sudden, massive flood of printed material washed over European society, and in its wake, it would reshape the continent's most powerful institutions, its scholarship, its religion, its science, and its very sense of identity. The first sphere to be transformed was the world of ideas that was already in ferment, the Renaissance. This great intellectual and artistic movement was driven by a rediscovery of the classical texts of ancient Greece and Rome. Before printing, this rediscovery was a slow, piecemeal affair. A scholar might have to travel hundreds of miles to a specific monastery just to read a rare manuscript of a work by Cicero or Plato. The texts themselves were often corrupted, full of errors accumulated over centuries of manual copying. The printing press changed everything. Printers, eager to cater to the growing market of humanist scholars, began to seek out the best possible manuscripts of these classical works and reproduce them by the hundreds. Aldus Manutius in Venice, for example, dedicated his press to printing scholarly, accurate, and affordable editions of the Greek classics, making the works of Aristotle, Thucydides, and Sophocles widely available for the first time. This created a unified international community of scholars, a republic of letters. A humanist in England could now be certain he was reading the exact same text of Plato as his counterparts in Florence or Paris. This allowed for a more rigorous and collaborative form of scholarship. The flood of classical texts provided new models for literature, new approaches to philosophy, and new perspectives on politics and art that directly challenged the rigid scholastic traditions that had dominated medieval thought. The printing press did not create the Renaissance, but it was the engine that drove it. The high-octane fuel that spread its ideas with incredible speed and depth, allowing it to become a continent-wide transformative movement. If the press fueled the Renaissance, it outright powered the Protestant Reformation. It is impossible to imagine the success of Martin Luther without the printing press. Before Gutenberg, religious dissent was relatively easy to contain. A heretic might preach to a few villages, and their ideas, passed by word of mouth, could be suppressed by church authorities before they spread too far. The press gave a single voice the power to speak to a nation. In October of 1517, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, he was initiating what he thought would be a formal, academic debate in Latin. But someone took the theses down, translated them into German, and brought them to a printer. Within 2 weeks, copies were circulating throughout Germany. Within a month, they were being read all across Europe. The church could no longer silence a single man. It was now faced with a published idea, an idea that was replicating itself in print shops from Wittenberg to London. What followed was the world's first great media war. Luther proved to be a master of the new medium. He was a prolific writer, and he wrote not just in scholarly Latin, but in powerful, direct, and earthy German, the language of the common people. He and his supporters used the press to flood Germany with thousands of pamphlets, sermons, and treatises attacking the doctrines and authority of the Catholic Church. The Church, in turn, used the press to issue its own condemnations and counter-arguments. But Luther's message, which emphasized a personal relationship with God and the primacy of Scripture, resonated with a public that was now, for the first time, empowered to engage with these ideas directly. The single most revolutionary act of this period was Luther's translation of the New Testament into German. First published in 1522, printers could not keep up with the demand. For the first time, ordinary lay people who could read, or have someone read to them, could access the core text of their faith in their own language. They no longer had to rely solely on the interpretation of the priest and the authority of the church. The press had shattered the church's centuries-old monopoly on scripture and religious knowledge, and in doing so, it irrevocably splintered the religious unity of Western Christendom. Just as it had upended religion, the press also laid the essential groundwork for the scientific revolution. Science, as we know it, relies on the accurate sharing of data and the ability of researchers to replicate and build upon the work of others. In the age of manuscripts, this was a difficult, often impossible task. A hand-drawn anatomical diagram would become distorted with each new copy. A table of astronomical observations could be rendered useless by a single copyist's error. Printing introduced the crucial concepts of fidelity and standardization. An astronomer like Tycho Brahe could meticulously record his observations, and once printed, every copy of his book would contain the exact same tables of data. This allowed other astronomers, like Johannes Kepler, to trust the data and use it as the foundation for their own groundbreaking calculations. The ability to reproduce images with perfect accuracy was just as revolutionary. Andreas Vesalius's masterpiece of anatomy On the Fabric of the Human Body, published in 1543, was filled with detailed and accurate illustrations of human anatomy based on his own dissections. These printed images swept away centuries of accumulated error and superstition, creating a new, verifiable foundation for the study of medicine. When Nicolaus Copernicus decided to publish his radical, sun-centered model of the cosmos, he could be sure that his complex arguments and diagrams would reach a wide audience of mathematicians and astronomers exactly as he had intended them. The press created a feedback loop of discovery. It allowed scientists across Europe to join a single, continent-wide conversation to share results, critique each other's work, and collectively build a new understanding of the natural world. This cumulative, collaborative enterprise, the very heart of the modern scientific method, was simply not possible before the age of print. Finally, beyond the grand movements of religion and science, the printing press quietly but inexorably began to reshape the very fabric of society itself. The sudden availability of cheap books, pamphlets, and almanacs created a powerful new incentive for ordinary people to learn how to read. While mass literacy was still centuries away, the process began with the press. This growing readership, in turn, created a new commercial pressure on printers. They wanted to sell as many books as possible, and the largest markets were not among the Latin-speaking elites, but among the growing middle classes in the cities who spoke the vernacular tongues: German, French, English, and Italian. This shift to vernacular printing had a profound and lasting effect on language itself. At the time, languages were a chaotic soup of regional dialects. A person from one part of Germany might have difficulty understanding someone from another. Printers, in order to sell to the widest possible audience within a region, had to make choices. They had to pick a particular dialect, and they had to standardize spelling and grammar. The choices made by influential printers in major centers like London, Paris, and the region around Wittenberg, simply due to the vast volume of material they produced, gradually became the accepted, standard form of that language. The press was a great engine of linguistic standardization, forging the modern national languages we recognize today. This, in turn, helped to foster a new sense of shared identity. People who might never meet, who lived in different parts of a kingdom, began reading the same news, the same stories, and the same laws, all in the same standardized language. This shared print culture was a critical ingredient in the decline of feudalism and the rise of the modern nation-state. The world after Gutenberg was a world of new connections and new divisions, a world where ideas could cross borders with unprecedented ease, and where the power of the printed word had begun to build the modern world. Epilogue. The legacy of the printing press. We have journeyed through centuries and across continents, tracing the remarkable evolution of an idea, the power of the printed word. Our story began in the workshops of Tang Dynasty China, where the patient art of woodblock printing first made it possible to replicate a text, culminating in the creation of the Diamond Sutra, a testament to an ancient desire for the mass dissemination of knowledge. We saw this concept leap forward with the ingenuity of Bi Sheng and his invention of movable type using baked clay, and later refined in Korea with the casting of durable, elegant metal type, evidenced by the magnificent Jikji. These Eastern innovations, while revolutionary, were ultimately constrained by the beautiful complexity of their logographic writing systems, remaining tools of preservation more than agents of radical change. Our story then shifted to the heart of 15th-century Europe, to the city of Mainz and the workshop of Johannes Gutenberg. We saw how his unique background as a metallurgist and entrepreneur allowed him to create not just a single device, but a complete and brutally efficient system of manufacturing. His combination of a lead-tin antimony alloy, his precision hand mold for casting type, his adaptation of the powerful screw press, and his formulation of a new oil-based ink represented a pivotal moment in human history. The Gutenberg Bible was more than a book. It was the stunning proof of concept for a technology that would irrevocably alter the course of civilization. From Mainz, the printing press exploded across Europe, becoming the engine of the continent's greatest transformations. It fueled the intellectual fires of the Renaissance, powered the religious upheaval of the Protestant Reformation, and laid the very foundation for the collaborative enterprise of the scientific revolution. It began the slow but inexorable march toward mass literacy, standardized our languages, and helped forge our modern sense of national identity. The legacy of the printing press is, in short, the modern world itself. It was the first technology to truly democratize information, breaking the monopolies on knowledge once held by the powerful and the privileged. It taught us that an idea once fixed in print could be unstoppable, capable of challenging empires and reshaping the deepest convictions of humanity. Today, as we navigate a digital world of instant global communication, we are living in a direct extension of the revolution that began with Gutenberg. The core principle remains the same, the belief that the free and wide dissemination of information is the most powerful force for change the world has ever known. The echoes of that first pull of the press bar in Mainz still resonate today, in every book we read, every article we share, and in the very structure of our connected world. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.